Welcome, everyone, to the latest session on the important work of the International Parliamentary Network for Education, which has launched this year to bring together parliamentarians from nearly 40 countries now who want to champion the cause of education and the campaign for 12 years of quality education around the world. And we've got a very, very special set of speakers for us today. Je veux aussi dire que pour nos collègues francophones, il y a une traduction simultanée. Vous devez pousser sur le bouton au fond de votre écran. Et si vous avez des difficultés, veuillez contacter le secrétariat. Obviously, I think we're all used to this now, but if you're not speaking, please remain on mute to minimize background noise. We're linking people from many, many time zones on this call. And please do use the chat function to put any requests to ask questions from our amazing speakers. We've been having a series of really good seminars. This is the fourth on a range of different topics. Today's topic is obviously the implications for education for COVID-19, and we know that the IMF are warning about the level of education budgets around the world because they're predicting a 5% decrease in the world's economy. And obviously, education budgets are likely to be a victim of that. They're likely to be a victim of the fact that smaller economies mean that there are smaller overseas development assistance budgets as well. The UK next year is going to be trying to keep the focus on education. We've put it on the agenda for the G7 presidency that starts in January. We are proud to be co-hosting with our Kenyan friends the Global Partnership for Education Replenishment as well during 2021. And of course, very pleased that the UK and Kenya, myself and Senator Musaruve from Kenya are the founding co-chairs of this really important network. Anyway, enough from me. I really want to introduce our amazing speakers today. I'm going to give the floor first to Andreas Schleicher, who joins us as the Director of Education and Skills and the Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development at the OECD. As you know, Andreas is an absolutely leading expert in terms of the importance of education, but also really on measuring progress in terms of education. And after we've heard from Andreas, we'll also hear from Elias Abdi Jalal, who is Director General at the Ministry of Education in Kenya. And once we've heard from our two speakers, I will open the floor up for questions from parliamentarians who are joining us. So first up, Andreas, may you share with us 5 to 10 minutes of your thinking in terms of the challenge that education has been dealt as a result of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet, and thanks for inviting me. I think this is an important topic. I know parliamentarians have to deal with many urgent issues, but education is really the important one, and our schools today will be our economy tomorrow. And I think there is a great risk that education is losing out in this moment. I want to say a few words on the global economic outlook and what it could mean for the financing of education, then talk about where the world stands on official donor assistance to the developing world, and conclude with some thoughts on how we could close the financing gap. On the outlook, we've seen obviously a sharp decline in our economies this year. OECD projects that global GDP will rise by around 4.5% in 2021 and maybe 3.25% in 2022. So a slight upswing, but from a kind of sharp decline. We can also hope that scientific progress, pharmaceutical advances, we've seen the news, and adjustments in the behavior of firms and people will hopefully keep that virus in check. And so restrictions on mobility may be lifted progressively. But, even in an upside scenario, the pandemic has damaged the social and economic fabric of countries worldwide. I think that's now abundantly clear for everyone. Output is projected to remain 5% below the pre-crisis expectations in most countries in 22. And that also raises the specters of a lot of permanent costs from this pandemic. So not just, as a kind of dip, but something that will remain. And obviously that has consequences for education financing. If you think about the time before COVID, we had annual global spending on education of approximately 4.7 trillion US dollars. And of that, you had 3 trillion, 65% spent in high income countries, and only 22 billion, that's 0.5% of that total, spent in low income countries. Now, even though the two groups of countries have roughly the same number of school-aged children. So a huge imbalance in the resources available for education around the world. And I think that's important for us to keep in context when we talk about this impact. What this means, there is currently a 148 billion US dollar annual financing gap in low and lower middle income countries to achieve Sustainable Goal 4 in 2030. And you can add to this the additional cost due to COVID-19 coming from school closures, and that's raising this financing gap by maybe 1/3, 30 to 45 billion US dollars. The only way to avoid that is to invest now in remedial and re-enrollment programs, not helping students to catch up, which could reduce the additional cost at least by 75%. But we are talking about a very, very significant gap between what is needed, even in the best conditions, to close this gap. Now, where does money come from? Overall, you have government spending about 79%, or government sources account for 79% of total spending on education. 20% comes from household, and donors account for 0.3%. Now, very, very tiny amount when you look at this on a global scale. But when you go into low-income countries, donors can account for 12% of education expenditure. So what happens on ODA may only be a blip on a kind of global scale, but it could mean a huge difference for the least developed countries and some middle-income countries as well. We have also importance, of remittances. They're very important, increase in spending by up to 1/3 in sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Southern Asia, Southeastern Asia. And again, that's also a source of financing that is now at stakes. So all major sources of education financing, whether this is about domestic education budgets, household contributions, remittance, all of that is now under severe threat, and that is the problem that we are looking at today, I think. Now, let me turn now, second component on domestic financing and donor assistance. So where is the world in meeting requirements? It's clear that the threat to education budgets is going to affect all countries, but we should be particularly concerned about those countries that are furthest away from achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 4, and those are the low and middle income countries. In these countries, I already mentioned this, we estimate that the annual financing gap will increase from $148 billion to nearly $200 billion. That's every year. Domestic resources are always the main source of financing for developing countries, but I already said the foreign aid plays a very, very important role in some low-income countries. If you think about in 2016, so that's still pre-COVID, aid to education had reached its highest level since we have recorded it. That was about 13.4 billion. But if it's counted as a share of official donor assistance, it was only 7.2% of the total sector allocable aid. So that's only a very small amount of the total volume of donor assistance that actually went to education. And this is now even further at threat. It's difficult to say, difficult to project. These decisions are all made, as we speak. But we already have seen actually two large donors at our DAC committee at the OECD that they will cut their aid in 2021. And most others have indicated they are maintaining their budgets as a share of GDP, but with shrinking GDP, it means there's less money available. So we need, even if countries say, yes, we keep our percentage, but the pie is shrinking because economies are shrinking, then, you simply have a lot less resources available. The most optimistic scenario for aid is that donor countries, again, will maintain their current levels as a share of national income. And that is currently 0.3% against the target of 0.7%. And so actual resources will in any case decline. I think we can take this as a certain. And the inevitable decline of donor assistance is then going to be compounded by spending choices. What you see now is that countries are prioritizing health and social welfare. No, that's understandable, but it means in a kind of zero-sum game, education is receiving less. And it is therefore very likely that in 2021 and probably beyond, will be much less than what we had in 2016, and probably is. So let me conclude with a few thoughts on what could be done or what needs to be done to close the financing gap. Actually, with regard to domestic resources, the OECD has spent a lot of time to actually elaborate a virtuous cycle where, you have improved education outcomes that then contribute to per capita income growth. That link is very, very strong, particularly in the developing world. If you look, make historical growth regressions, those countries that actually have been able to improve their education outcomes have been able to translate that into steep economic growth. And that then, economic growth increases your tax revenues, and with, good policy and administrative choices, that can then, translate into more government kind of possibilities. You have more resources, you can allocate more to education, and that can then, lead to further enhancement of educational outcomes. So there is this virtuous cycle that I think policy should really, really focus on, particularly if, achievement of the SDGs on everybody's minds. It is not just important to increase the volume of international aid to education, but also predictability and effectiveness of aid. I think that's something that is particularly at stake now. Can we be sort of, education is sort of a long-term business. You have a very heavy infrastructure, and to make that predictable is very, very important. And it needs to be well targeted, and particularly those most in need. If you look at, stimulus money, since the outbreak of COVID-19, governments have invested about almost $12 trillion in stimulus packages, but you have only 0.78% of that being allocated to education and training. So again, there's been a lot of money available to stimulate the economies after this crisis, but the share that is actually invested in education is almost not measurable. And despite the huge impact the COVID crisis had on education, you had 1.6 billion young people being excluded from their schools with huge learning losses. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And again, support for the most vulnerable, especially children, youth, and the less skilled, the low skilled, who have not been sheltered from the crisis and who will be the brunt. When this actually is over, those will be the ones who are going to be most vulnerable. You should have, a fiscal policy, therefore needs to be, directed to the vulnerable groups, and particularly outside the usual social welfare system. I think that's also very, very important. Within the system, we have mechanisms, but lots of people are not covered by this. And that's, I think, going to be one of the policy responses. There are some good examples as well. You can look at, Korea, that has announced stimulus packages in several phases, and allocating around 5% of those additional funds to education, and very well targeted. I think it's a great example how countries can actually look forward and make sure that education is part of those considerations. Australia is also a good example. Has taken a wide range of measures to address needs in education, and also the training sector, including skills training and job market needs. I think a very, very good part of the stimulus package as well. So there are some good examples. I must say, however, I find them really few. I don't think many countries, the majority of countries, have given much thought to the longer needs of education and training, and I'm talking mainly about, the formal education sector. Once you get into actually vocational education and training, the situation is even more dire. Final thought, of course, we need to protect the funding, but we should also not lose sight of opportunities to increase the quality of spending and efficiency of education. The world before the crisis was not great. We actually had a lot of money that wasn't actually so well targeted. So that's, I think, something that we should not lose sight of as well. But, in a nutshell, the situation is not good. There's a great risk that actually, we compromise our future for, the urgencies of the present. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Andreas. That was really an important highlighting of really two main issues. One is that we are going to have to be a very strong voice for education, where it's competing with so many other priorities as we go into 2021. But you succinctly emphasized how important it is to spend money on education, not least because this is what will deliver the future, that we can cope with these kinds of changes. I think, parliamentary colleagues, we will rely on the OECD to be able to tell us, in a world of constrained resources compared to previously, how we can spend education funds most effectively and most efficiently to deliver that quality education that you mentioned at the end. So thank you very much for those introductory remarks. I now want to bring in Elias Abdi Ajilau from Kenya. As I said earlier, he's the Director General at the Ministry of Education in Kenya. The UK is proud that we will be co-hosting the Replenishment for the Global Partnership for Education in 2021. It's going to be an event where we look to crowd in $5 billion worth of funding towards education around the world in poorer countries. Kenya obviously has great leadership in this area, and is internationally recognized for growing its funding for basic education and for focusing on those who are excluded. So may I say to you, Director General, that the floor is yours to speak to our parliamentarians. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished members of the International Parliamentary Network for Education, participating guests. I'm delighted to join you in this important forum where we will discuss on protecting and growing financing for education. The timing for this webinar is important as it gives us an opportunity to seriously focus on practical ways of growing financing for education, more so in the current COVID-19 pandemic. Madam Chair, Kenya's national education priorities include ensuring universal, inclusive, quality, and relevant education and training that is accessible to all. And in terms of financing, the key highlights of our country include meeting the international recommended percentage of annual expenditure of 15 to 20%. Our country has met that threshold, and we do provide free primary education that is fee-free. We provide also free day secondary education. And to us as a country, basic education should be free and compulsory as per our Article 43 and 53 of the Constitution of Kenya. Madam Chair, analysis that has been made in our annual statistical booklet of 2019, total expenditure on education showed that the government, that is the public expenditure, is 53%. But I also want to report that the household is still contributing. Parents are still paying 3% of basic education in terms of cost in form of uniform and the rest of that go with it. We also have a huge and vibrant boarding school system where parents have to contribute they contribute to accommodation. The source of funding on education in Kenya include the national government, which is #1 in terms of funding. We also have our county governments that are in charge of pre-primary education, that is nursery. Some people want to call it kindergarten and so on. The household, of course, hugely also participates. We have a vibrant international national government and non-governmental organizations, the religious organizations. We have also a vibrant faith-based organization that provide education. The private sector and companies also equally support education in this country. We also have support from bilaterals and multilateral organizations. We have funding from, say, for example, organizations like DFID, the World Bank, African Development Bank, are also supporting the education sector, what we call here locally, the Education Development Partners Consultative Group. But I just want to note that the bulk of funding that goes to the sector mainly goes to teacher salaries. Generally, as you are aware, over the years, the gap in financing of education has been increasing. The situation has been aggravated more by the COVID-19, which is inflicting damage across global economies as lockdowns and widespread closures stifle economic activity. And as a country, we are also affected. This is likely to affect the global economy, and resources to support education will also be affected. In developing countries like ours, the financing gap is therefore expected to widen with the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you have noted, Madam Chair, we are also glad to join you, the UK, in ensuring that we reach our target of raising $5 billion to support education in low-income countries. But I just want to note that the low-income countries are likely to find it increasingly difficult to adequately finance education as a result of this pandemic. Locally, we have been facing some challenges because our schools, unlike in the past, have been closed for the last 6 months. And even now, as we have opened, we opened it partially, mainly for the examination classes. So we have more of our students still at home, and we expect to open the schools in January. And we're facing a lot of adverse effects that are being reported, including, issues to do with child abuse, child labor, child pregnancy, and so on, which we are addressing. But having talked about the financing gap, you are aware, Madam Chair, when the World Converged in Dakar in the year 2000, the world came up with the Education for All goals, and it was agreed that no country with a credible education sector plan will be thwarted from achieving, its education goals as a result of lack of resources. But 20 years down the line, the reality is that we're still facing challenges in education, be it access, quality, or relevance, governance, even within the education systems, and accountability. There's still a huge challenge. And therefore, as a country, we have, suggestions on how to, meet this financing gap. One of them is governments should prioritize education and target those most in need. And this is where our members of parliament come in, because they are the ones that, when it comes to budgeting and all that, they have a huge responsibility. As a country, we have done our part, but we still have pockets within Kenya that are still not yet reached. Among them are the special needs community, the children that have special needs, disability. We still have parts of this country has gender issues. The parity between boys, girls is not yet achieved. We also have the mobile communities, immigrants. In the northern part of the country, we have nomads, people who are on the move. And it has always been problematic providing them education. Countries should find new ways to raise additional revenue to finance basic education. And then we also want to join, like the director has pointed out, other sectors, ODA funding, has been at least attracting a lot of attention, but education, somehow there has been a decline in terms of ODA funding. And we therefore want to say that for us to achieve meaningful achievement in the education sector, I think there's need to also raise overseas development assistance. Government should enhance also, which we rarely talk about, is need to enhance efficiency in the education system, find ways of achieving more with little funding. because even within the education system, there are bound to be leakages and wasteful use of resources. So it is something that we need also to look at. Government also to support private sector offering education, because DCP countries, developing country partners, may not be in a position to provide education and reach all their children with education. So there's need to promote the private sector in ensuring that education is also achieved. And then the recent, of course, declaration by the UN that the right of education needs to be revised to include right to connectivity. And we've learned a lot from this pandemic, the use of technology, so that learning can take place not only on face-to-face, but also the use of online platforms and all that. There's need also to take note of that. And as for the COVID, when we as a country, we detected the first case sometime in March this year, the country also decided to come up with plans for the education sector. We did actually, as a sector, come up with a plan to how to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that we took up was to see how we can increase the social distance in schools. And therefore, government released funds to put up more infrastructure, water and sanitation facilities. And we've also taken up the responsibility of employing more teachers. Because if the classroom size reduces, with this need for, the requirements for teachers will increase. The national government has come up with dual effect economic stimulus programs. For example, we came up with the fabrication of desks and chairs for schools and employed the local youth within where the schools are located. Our county governments are assisting the national government, especially in provision of adequate water to schools, because their responsibility. MPs, our members of parliament, have also some funding, what we're calling the Constituency Development Fund. And they have really supported the sector in putting up more classrooms, dormitories, wash facilities, and so on. The ministry prepared a COVID-19 response plan. The plan has attracted funding, even from the World Bank, from the Global Partnership for Education. The GP allocated $11 million to support us implement that plan. Local organizations, for example, banks have donated safety items. We got a lot of donation in form of masks and so on, sanitary pads for the girls. Organizations, the UN agencies, UNESCO, UNICEF have also come up. We have quite a number of philanthropic organizations who have also joined us in supporting the sector. And so maybe at this point, Madam Chair, I just wanted also to say something about the role of members of parliament in ensuring that we raise our hand in terms of supporting education. And I will say that there's need to come up with come up with legislations that ensure adequate funding for education. For example, laws that require all productive members of the society to contribute to education. Appropriate adequate budgets to finance education, provide oversight to ensure funds allocated to education sector efficiently and effectively utilized. So again, if our members of parliament can take up the oversight role, it will really assist within countries to ensure that the issue of efficiency and the governance and accountability for funds are also taken on board. Advocates for more funding to the education sector, MPs should join hands, for example, under the International Parliamentary Network for Education, to speak in one voice on ways of protecting and strengthening financing education. In some countries like Kenya, where MPs have a budget like the CDF, the Constituency Development Fund, most of the resources should be used to improve infrastructure in learning institutions. MPs can also play the role of patron for education institutions in their electoral areas, build linkages with NGOs and donors to raise extra funding for learning institutions. So I would say, Madam Chair, that in terms of the domestic funding, we have done the much we could. But as a country, we have also experienced a lot in terms of access. But at the moment, the aspect of learning is where we are focusing. I know as a country, we're doing fairly well in the Southern and Eastern African Consortium for Measuring Education Quality is an assessment measuring tool where 15 African countries participate. We're basically, and the assessment is done at grade 6. We are around number 2 in reading and also around number 3 in numeracy. And we are doing well in terms of regionally. But I will say that we still have regions within the country that have not been reached, especially the communities I've mentioned. So I'll just stop at that at this point. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Director General, and thank you also for highlighting the progress in Kenya, but also very importantly mentioning the crucial role of teachers, because clearly the vast majority of the funding for education goes into making sure that we train and deploy enough teachers in the education system. Also thought it was interesting the point you made about technology, and be interesting perhaps to hear from in the Q&A about the value of radio as well, because I've heard that it's not always just the internet, it can actually be things like radio and good old-fashioned textbooks that can help, particularly with nomadic communities and communities where perhaps they are experiencing disruption because of the pandemic. We've come to the point where I'm going to open up the floor to colleagues to ask questions. If you have got a question, could you perhaps indicate in the chat section, or just wave at me and put your hand up, but probably a bit more reliable to indicate in the chat itself. I'm going to see my good colleague from Ottawa, where it must be about what, 6 o'clock in the morning. Mike is waving at me, and Mike, would you like to ask your questions?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's 6 here. At home, if I was back home in Edmonton, it would be 4. So I'm fortunate to be here, and it's very dark outside, so I had to turn on my lights. I don't have the natural light flying in here. I think that the first question I just had was just around measurement and how we measure success. Because it seems like the more conversations I had, I was just having a conversation with somebody in the UAE and talking about the sort of area around that, and the woman I was talking to was just talking about teachers in a certain area that she had mentioned, not UAE specifically, but that they're doing a great job of getting kids in school, but the teachers aren't very educated themselves. And so what is, how do we know, how do we measure success? We're talking about raising $5 billion. Canada is one of the donors to that. And I've been a good friend, a champion, I think, in a sense, for GPE and for ECW, but how do we measure success? It has to be more than just kids in school, right?
Yeah, no, great question. Andreas, so how does the OECD measure success?
Yeah, I have a clear answer to this. I think the only criterion is student learning outcomes. And in fact, I think we need to get a lot better to actually track what students actually know and can do. That's what the OECD's PISA comparisons are about. We every 3 years, we go around and actually test abilities of students, and the picture is quite sobering. Actually, I also must say, for many advanced nations, the relationship between spending and outcomes becomes very patchy. You have countries like Singapore and Korea that spend little and achieve a lot, and you have countries like the UAE who spend a lot and achieve very little. I actually think you raise a very important point. I think in all of this, success is about what students learn, and success is about how they translate those learnings into labor market success. And both of those dimensions are ones that are often, including in the education community, not well incorporated into our metrics. Too often we look at spending, the time that we spend, the class size, the kind of volume of learning time as criteria, and they're not good surrogates for what education is about, namely raising the knowledge and skills of young people.
But Andreas, could you just elaborate a bit more on the measurement question? Because one of the big debates here in the UK is around exams and how we actually have exams during the pandemic. And I wondered if you could share with us what you see as being best practice in terms of how we measure pupil performance during a pandemic.
Yeah, actually, I think there are many good examples. In fact, the digital learning opportunities give us better means. We have a much better way to actually, if you combine, digital learning with learning analytics and big data, you get a much better picture of what young people learn and how they learn. In fact, maybe in the future we can do away with the kind of post hoc testing of people and actually get, you know, much better picture of the learning incidence and intensity of learners. So I think digitalization provides great opportunities here. But in the meantime, I think many countries actually were able to deliver their exams even in a COVID environment. You know, it's much easier actually to run an exam than to run a class. You know, in a class, you want to have students to talk, you want to have actually some interaction and so on. In an exam setting, you know, social distancing is not so easy to apply. In fact, that's what you usually do even in normal times. So I think actually the measurement process, I don't think is very difficult, but it doesn't just get enough attention. I really believe that's where many education systems fall short. And particularly, you know, when they do this, they create some average, but actually the real measurement challenge lies in looking at social economic disparities. You know, how do different social demographic groups actually perform? And how does that translate into, you know, better resources? And I don't think education systems do generally a good job in tracking that. No. And in the absence of this, you know, speaking with parliamentarians, if you look actually, where have increases in education spending been going in the OECD countries? That's the countries I'm most familiar with. You know, we have spent more money on things that are very popular among politicians. You know, like making classes smaller. You know, we have not spent much money on making teachers better, you know, investing in the professional capabilities of teachers. And at the end, you know, we have actually ended up spending more money and not achieved increases in outcomes. That's, I think, the part that I think this COVID crisis brings home to us. Now that there is less resources available, we have to think hard about how we increase effectiveness and efficiency in spending. And direct money to the most vulnerable student groups. What makes countries like China or Singapore so successful is their capacity to align resources with needs. In the Western world, you know, we do the opposite. And I actually think Kenya is not much better on this. Now, we spend money on the wealthy, you know, who have actually access to great teachers and great resources. And those kids who need education most are the ones that lose out. And I think this is the other part of the picture.
Thanks, Andreas. Mike, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, only because I don't see anybody else's hand up, so I think I'm okay.
I've got a couple more people I'm going to bring in for questions, but please, I definitely think you have time for a follow-up, Mike.
Yeah. So the follow-up is kind of maybe to make a point at some point too. I'm a Conservative member of Parliament in Canada, 15 years, and you know, in 2010 when we hosted the G8, we put a substantial commitment towards MNCH, so maternal newborn child health, Muskoka initiative. In this last election campaign in 2019, we lost, and it wasn't because of what I'm about to say, but we had a platform commitment to cut 25% of our international development spending. I disagreed with that. I made it well known. But what I've said to the international community is we need to tell better stories so that Canadians, and I'm sure Harriet can relate to this in her country, but so that Canadians understand where that international development spending is going. Because right now with COVID, there's so many challenges here. There is a ton of pressure to move money away from that. I think there's a huge opportunity in education because I think it's something that Canadians of all political stripes could get their heads around. Capacity building in a future where we don't need to spend as much money because we've built the capacity within systems and helped countries build their capacity. So it's more of a point than I guess a question, but I think the measurements talking about what we're going to accomplish, because if we look at the last 20 years and the money that's been spent, I'd say it's hard to tell that as a success story. This, you know what I mean? Like the fact that we're asking for another $5 billion is a challenge. And so if we're asking for $5 billion, we've got to convince not just members of parliament, we have to be able to go back and convince our constituents that this is money that's really important to spend.
Yeah.
Director General, did you want to respond to those points, particularly the point that Mr. Schleicher made about Kenya and the importance of helping those most left behind in your system?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think The last few years in the education systems, especially here in Kenya and most of the developing countries, has been, reevaluating itself and so on. And we were trying to see how we can measure success. And one of the things that we have been doing as a country is the aspect of assessment within the learning, environment. Because in the 60s, when the country gained independence, the main thing was to take children to school. But you see, it's not just about going to school, but what takes place within the classroom is very critical. And we, as a country, what we have been doing is we are, not so much emphasized on education for examination. We are not looking at just summative evaluation, where somebody, goes through primary education, they sit an exam, move to the next stage. No, but we just want to, ensure that the child moving from grade 1 to grade 2, to see whether that child has got the competencies that were required in grade 1. And take, for example, literacy and numeracy skills. What we do is we do assessments, within that are continuous. And this assessment is assessment for learning, to see to it. And every time we come up with, supporting the teachers, debriefing them, working with them very closely, coming up even with a fluency test, where we randomly, for example, at the ministry, we go to class, call a few students randomly, take them to a fluency test, on numeracy and on literacy, to see whether the child has got the reading competencies that are required. But another latest thing in the education sector, I would say the last 2 years, is what we are calling the development world calls results-based financing, to see to it that you only fund subject to achievement of particular results. Say, for example, I'm just taking an example of scholarships, giving maybe scholarship to poor households, children from poor households. You want to really see whether results have been achieved based on the scholarship that has been given. The first thing is the child physically attending? Then number 2 is the child learning? You need to subject, you're funding, fine, but is he making use of the education that that is being provided? These are things that we are looking at, and then we put corrective measures if there are challenges in terms of the child learning and so on. And then the other thing is measuring success is we compare ourselves regionally. We have the national assessment, SACMEC is there. I'm sure the director also, they have the PISA and all these teams in some countries, and so on. And even Kenya, we want to venture into that at the international level on PISA-D and also TIMIS. Because we need to constantly measure and assess, not just examination. And then on the aspect of, it is true that every developing country, I think there are pockets, I keep on saying there are pockets, that have been left out. If those of us who are maybe familiar with the geography of Kenya, in the northern part, in Turkana, for example, that borders South Sudan, the counties that border Somalia, we even have challenges of terrorist attacks. You must have heard what happened in Garissa University, and the teachers even fled from that area. So you find the children on that end of the country are left behind as compared to the rest of the country. So we have these challenges, but we as a country, for example, among the nomadic community, the mobile communities, we have come up with some models, like for example, putting up boarding schools where the nomads can leave the children behind as they go and with their livestock and so on. So, and government funds these schools, sends teachers to these schools. So I think I agree that funding also should be targeted, so that we target where it is most needed, and that is the reality. And even as a country, we have our own way. For example, we have grants that target specifically these parts of the country that are still left behind, because we still have, out of our 47 counties, we have some maybe counties that are registering even an enrollment access of 60%. The other 40 are out of school. So these are the issues that, but I think I see, because education, unlike other sectors, is not, results may not be immediate. Because when we talk of, for example, the health sector, for example, at the moment we have this COVID pandemic, hoping that the vaccinations and all these that have been announced, very soon maybe the disease could be contained. Ebola we had in, For example, in West Africa, with the vaccination and all that, the world sees results. But you know, you may not see immediate results. But the reality is that education, especially basic education, makes the human being functional. Without it, you can't function. You know, the person cannot function and cannot even contribute to the economy. Basic education makes the person to be a better farmer, would be able to use maybe and measure fertilizer for his farm, will be able to inject and measure, you know, if you have a cow or a goat, and you know, you're able to even use a siren to measure if it is 2 milliliters and so on. Basic education is very critical. And I think maybe the donor community, there could be some fatigue here and there, but the thing is, I would say it's not an immediate result, but results is long term. So mine is just to encourage ourselves that any shilling given to education is not a shilling lost or a dollar lost, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think this is such a crucial point, and for politicians like Mike and myself and other conservatives around the world who make the case for global education, you know, those great statistics that can be used, you know, the powerful ones like every year you spend in school increases someone's income by 10%, you know, just plays to the value of this in terms of making the world a more prosperous place and a healthier place as a result. So I think those kind of stats, Andreas, you know, and Director General, if you can share those kinds of powerful points with us as politicians, we're always looking for those clear, persuasive arguments of the importance of this area. I see we've spoken a lot about global partnerships for education, and we've got Heather Saunders joining us from who is International Advocacy Partnerships co-lead at Global Partnership for Education. So Heather, we've got this wonderful panel. What would you like to ask them?
Thank you. Thanks, Harriet, and thanks to the panelists, Andreas and Abdi. Those presentations were fantastic. Really, really informative, and yeah, we share a lot of your concerns around the way that the risks to education financing. We thank all of the partners on the call for their support to GP and our financing campaign. It's much, much appreciated. I wanted to ask Elias about, you mentioned Kenya kind of slowly reopening schools following COVID, and I wanted to ask a bit if you could say a bit more about that phased approach and when your long-term plans are to have all children back in school. Obviously it's pandemic dependent, but yeah, just interested in how that's being managed, how kind of schools are being guided by the ministry on how to prevent COVID, and what measures are in place to make sure that schools are opening safely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. We have already said that in Kenya, we have partially opened our schools. At the primary school level, out of 8 grades, we only have 2 grades now on session. At secondary education level, we are out of 4 classes, we only have 1 class, that's the examination class, the Form 4s. But we have just released in the last month our revised academic calendar, and all schools will reopen on the 4th of January for the remaining terms of the year 2020. We are a little bit cautious because our classes, especially in a number of our schools, are congested. We have one school, for example, that has a total of 5,000 people here in Nairobi, but only has 51 classrooms. So you can imagine it's around 100 people per class. So what we have done and what we are working on as a ministry is to ensure that those schools that have high enrollment, we want to come up with a calendar. Because every school in this country is managed by a board, and we want to work the board of those schools. And this school that has 5,000 people, for example, we want to come up with maybe a modality where we at any given time only 50% of the students there at any given day, so that we come up with maybe an approach like a shift system. On Monday, if we have maybe 2,500, Tuesday the other 2,500, and learning also continues at home. We want to see whether we can also come up with blended learning where we have the facilities, and it has taken off very well, the aspect of blended learning in our higher education institutions. that is the university and middle level colleges, it's doing well. But I want to say that for the few classes that are already on session, the cases of COVID are not alarming. They're under control. To such an extent that the lesson learned, we are even saying that our children could be even safer in the schools than in the community outside there. Because we are finding most of the time our boys could be in the football fields playing football, and they are not even putting on masks and so on. The issue of what I earlier said about the child abuse that's going on and so on. So the schools were not only learning centers, but they're also rescue centers for the children. And therefore, when they're preoccupied and doing schoolwork, they're even safer there. So our role at the moment, what we are thinking about at the moment, is to ensure that come January, we successfully open the schools, because between March and now, luckily we have a lot of knowledge about this pandemic, and I think we want to successfully ensure that we open. And one of the rules that we're saying is no school. The mask is very important for us. Every child of our lives can assist us. Thank you. I think that's all I just want to say. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks, Heather. We also were joined by Professor Ihon Vere from Nigeria, and he has had to drop out of the call due to connectivity issues, but I know he's left Oliver in the Secretariat with a question that he wanted to ask. So Oliver, can I give you the floor to ask that question on behalf of the Professor?
Thanks, Harriet. So the Professor is a Member of Parliament in Nigeria, as you set out. So he has a particular interest in the financing gap facing lower middle income countries, which I think you set out, Andreas, will make up the majority of the education financing gap come 2030. So he was wondering what would be your kind of key recommendation for countries like Nigeria and other lower middle income countries to increase the resources available for their education budgets. And separately, I'd also be interested to know kind of what role do you think debt relief has in terms of closing the education financing gap in low and lower middle income countries? Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. You know, I think if I think of a country like Nigeria, actually domestic resources are very, very critical for the country. I think the aid part is, you know, part of the picture, but it's really about raising domestic resources for education. You know, debt relief, the question is always, you know, to what extent the resources that are freed up actually go into the future of a country, including education. And that's something I think you know, that's history shows it's not always that case. I think really it's a matter of prioritizing resources within the country. You know, every country, the toughest decision that any individual in any country needs to take is, you know, how do I balance the present with the future? You know, how do I actually ensure that, you know, there's enough money invested in the long-term prospects of a country? And I don't think you get around that question, even in a country like Nigeria. I mean, in a way, these are resource-rich countries that have actually sources of revenue that, you know, directing enough of that to the future of the country, I think is very, very important on this. And I would also say, you know, Nigeria has also an efficiency challenge. I think there are also, you know, the spending in relation to, and that's the tougher part to address. That's not something that you can do in the short term. In the short term, I think you can ensure that resources are available. In the long term, you need to think about spending choices that drive actually increases in productivity in education. And I must say, you know, in the pre-COVID period, we have left that issue out of the discussion for too long. You know, I think we have been very complacent in terms of, you know, children are in school, so everything is fine. And I think now this is haunting us. And I think in a country like Nigeria, you can't neglect that part of the equation. No? But I think it's really about raising domestic resources. No? You cannot rely on too many other in a country like that.
Great, thank you. We'll feed that back to our members in Nigeria. Thank you.
Harriet, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I'm so bad with my toggle. But thank you. I think we've had everyone who has wanted to ask a question has had a chance to ask a question. And I think the themes that have really come out of today's discussion is very, very important, Andreas, I think, for the OECD to continue to publish the evidence of the impact that every year of quality education has on outcomes. I think very important that the OECD share with us in terms of quality and the work in terms of investing in teachers that really leads those outcomes and can be one of the best ways of investing education budgets. I think incredibly valuable to hear from Kenya in terms of the range of different challenges and the progress made against those challenges. But really the conclusion I wanted to just leave you with as policymakers is for us politicians, really those snappy, summary key points that can really make us powerful advocates for continuing to remember how important this budget is for the future, not only for 2030 and Sustainable Development Goal 4, but just for the general future of our planet. It would be really helpful for us to have those punchy key points that we can repeat and repeat and repeat. And the UK being in these key roles next year with the G7 and the GPE replenishment, particularly if you could share them with all of us in the UK and with colleagues across the International Parliamentary Network, whose delegations will also be taking part. So thank you all very much. I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers again for sparing this hour. Good to see you, Mike, in Ottawa, and I hope it gets light there soon. And thanks to the team at IPNED for organising yet another great seminar. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.